When many Americans imagine early colonial society, they often picture neatly separated populations. English colonists in one community, Native Americans in another, and enslaved Africans somewhere else entirely. The reality was far more complicated. The mountains and valleys of Appalachia became one of the most important cultural and genetic mixing zones in early American history. Beginning in the 16th century and continuing through the 17th century and early 18th century, the frontier served as a place where different peoples encountered one another, outside the strict social structures that existed in the more established colonial towns. European settlers moving westward encountered native communities that had occupied the land for thousands of years. Some traded, some married, some were adopted into communities, and others formed entirely new frontier societies. Africans, both enslaved and free, also became part of these communities, particularly in areas where rigid colonial oversight was weaker. Over generations, many of these family histories became obscured by changing racial laws, migration, social pressures, and the simple loss of records. Modern genetic genealogy is allowing us to rediscover portions of this forgotten history. The Appalachian frontier was not a single place but an enormous cultural borderland stretching down the mountain chain from Pennsylvania into the southern colonies. This region developed differently from the coastal colonies. The tidewater plantations of Virginia had established social hierarchies, wealthy landowners, and more formal government institutions. In contrast, the mountains and backcountry often existed beyond the immediate reach of colonial authority. Settlers included English, Scots-Irish, German, and other European groups who moved along routes, such as the Great Wagon Road into the Shenandoah Valley and beyond. These settlers entered landscapes that were already occupied and used by numerous indigenous peoples. The frontier was therefore not an empty wilderness awaiting settlement. It was a shared and contested landscape where many cultures interacted. A common misunderstanding in American history is the idea that native communities simply disappeared as European settlement expanded. What actually occurred was far more complex. Many indigenous communities remained in place. Some moved west, some joined neighboring tribes. Others entered frontier settlements through marriage, adoption, trade, or necessity. In Virginia and the Carolinas particularly, many smaller Siouan-speaking groups such as the Saponi, Tutelo, and related communities experienced tremendous disruption due to disease, warfare, colonial expansion, and displacement. Some groups merged with larger native nations, while others became part of multi-ethnic frontier communities. Their descendants often remained in the region but were later categorized in records under changing labels such as free persons of color, mulatto, white, or simply by local family names. The Great Wagon Road was one of the most significant migration routes in colonial America. Thousands of families traveled south through the Appalachian Valley searching for affordable land and new opportunities. These migrations created a constant movement of people. Families did not exist in isolation. They traded with neighbors, shared resources, intermarried, and formed communities. The frontier often lacked the rigid social oversight found in older colonial settlements. While racial and social boundaries certainly existed, they were frequently more fluid in remote areas where survival depended upon cooperation. This is why many frontier families today discover complex ancestry that does not align neatly with family stories or historical labels. Genetics is only one part of ancestry. Culture often preserves evidence of interactions between communities. Many traditions associated with Appalachian culture have roots from multiple populations. European settlers learned native methods for navigating forests, identifying medicinal plants, hunting local game, and adapting to unfamiliar environments. African contributions influenced agriculture, cooking traditions, music, craftsmanship, and oral storytelling. Over generations, these traditions blended into a unique Appalachian identity that cannot be attributed to a single culture. The mountains became a place where Old World traditions met indigenous knowledge and African influences, creating something entirely new. One of the most fascinating discoveries of modern genetic genealogy is the frequency with which hidden ancestry appears in families whose documented history tells only part of the story. A family may appear as white in one census, mulatto in another, and then return to white generations later. Others were recorded as Indian, free person of color, black, or simply under local terms that varied by region and time period. These changes were not always attempts to conceal identity. They often reflected the opinions of census takers, shifting laws, social pressures, marriage patterns, and changing community acceptance. Understanding these classifications requires studying the historical context rather than applying modern racial definitions to the past. Some of the most studied frontier populations are communities historically described as triracial isolates. The Melungeons of the Appalachian region are one example. For many years, myths surrounded their origins, including stories of lost colonies, Mediterranean sailors, or other exotic explanations. Modern historical and genetic research has shown that their origins are generally much more local and connected to early interactions among Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples in colonial America. The same complexity is seen among many other communities whose histories were shaped by migration, survival, discrimination, and changing social categories. DNA has transformed our ability to study the frontier. By combining autosomal DNA, Y-DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and traditional records, researchers can identify patterns of migration and shared ancestry that were impossible to see just a generation ago. However, DNA must be interpreted responsibly. A small percentage of indigenous ancestry does not identify a person with a specific tribal nation. Tribal identity involves living communities, historical continuity, culture, kinship, and often legal criteria established by sovereign indigenous nations. DNA is a tool for discovering biological connections, not a replacement for history or community. Genealogists often hear family traditions involving native ancestry, particularly in Appalachia and the American South. Some of these stories emerge from romantic ideas about indigenous ancestry that developed in later generations. Others were explanations for darker features, family secrecy, or social status. However, many stories do trace back to genuine ancestral connections that became hidden through generations of migration and changing records. The answer is never to automatically accept or dismiss oral tradition. Instead, the responsible genealogist evaluates every claim through a combination of historical documentation, oral history, community context, and genetic evidence. The Appalachian frontier was one of the great human crossroads of early America. Its people were not simply English, Scottish, German, African, or indigenous. Many families became a mixture of all of these histories over generations. Modern genetic genealogy is allowing descendants to revisit old assumptions and reconstruct stories that records alone could not preserve. Yet the greatest lesson of the frontier is not merely that people mix genetically. It is that communities adapted, cultures exchanged knowledge, and identities transformed in ways that challenge the simple categories created by later societies. The mountains still hold those stories within their families, traditions, records, and DNA. The Appalachian frontier was not a boundary between peoples. It was the place where many worlds met,